Okay. So we will go ahead and get our chat started. Tonight we are going to be talking about autism, and before we get into our PowerPoint presentation, I was wondering, I hope that everybody had a chance to watch that video. So for me, the video was really a powerful experience for me, because even though she's somebody that's, in my tribe, I'm obviously very comfortable communicating with verbal language. So anytime somebody can offer insight, it's very profound. So I was wondering if at least, let's say at least two of you could share what your thoughts were on the video.
I think like with the all the sensory components that I saw, I could kind of relate because I guess for myself, I do a lot of sensory seeking here and there, so I could kind of relate to that as that, the communication aspect, like you're trying to get something out, maybe you can verbalize it, and you kind of have to regulate yourself to kind of get all your systems balanced out to then kind of express yourself. So I kind of could see how to relate to that.
Thank you.
But what's interesting though is like makes you really look at autism or any other disorder, and you really have to analyze the behavior to kind of find out the underlying cause. Like it's not just somebody's acting out or behaving a certain way; they're just trying to express themselves, and that's how their body expresses themselves. So it was interesting.
Thank you, Parth.
No problem.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I have a go ahead. Good, Rob.
Okay. No, I just thought it was interesting to hear her perspective of how she was feeling and how she related to the world around her. I thought it was just very interesting because I never really get that much insight where someone's able to articulate really what they're going through who has autism. So to me, it was really enlightening to hear her perspective and how she was able to share what she was going through and how we may look at her as being and acting, out of the ordinary, but for her, that's ordinary. And that's how she's able to interact with her environment. So I thought it was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Robin. Jill, did you want to share? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Keith, go.
Okay. So one thing I was thinking was even comparing that situation, not even to someone that has autism, but even just a language barrier. Like I know I'm not in PED, so I haven't had much experience with like children with autism or anything. But even having a patient speaks a totally different language, they're still trying. You need to still be able to communicate and understand that. They're like, I don't know, they're not dumb or anything. It's just they speak a different language than you. You have to try to accommodate and try to learn, use different methods to try to communicate.
That's a good way to put it.
Thank you, Keith. Jill, what were your thoughts?
Couple different ones on the communication problem. There's no communication problem when it comes to a kid. I've had to work with in early intervention interpreters. The interpreter's there for the parent. When I was at school for the deaf, the kids didn't hear me, and I spoke. They didn't. They understand play. So, and I've worked being with the Autism Project and just working with adolescents and stuff like that. It's not a hinder. They have a gift. You just got to find it. They see things differently, and we're too black and white. I don't think they're black and white. I think we're too black and white because we expect this is what it is in society and this is the right way. That's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
They just go about it differently. So they're not rigid. We are. That's all.
Wow. Not, you know what, Jill, well, obviously,
Sorry.
no, I obviously resonate with that. I think that one comment, I think I've already shared this with you as a cohort, is that one common misconception, as far as it applies to me, is that, you know, many people who are on the spectrum are considered to have rigid thinking, and that's not the case as far as me. It's, I think, too much. I see too many variables. I see too many things. And sometimes being rigid or being, you know, saying, okay, well, this is the path that I'm going to take, is really kind of just like a regulation strategy, because I have to pick something. And because if I go off course a little bit, then the floodgates are open. And I'll spend hours and hours and hours thinking of all the possibilities. And I think that's what makes me a good occupational therapist. Because we analyze skills and we problem solve and we come up with creative solutions in order to help support people live life to the fullest. And I think that's actually helps me the way that I believe it helps me. But I really appreciated her insight, and it was really profound for me when she mentioned about how she's expected to approach people typically, but we don't often think about, well, how do we approach her? Or the world doesn't think about how can I come into her world? It's always expected to be the other way around, which is another thing about OT. And many of you already hit on it, that, you know, behavior is communication. They're communicating with us. And like Keith said, they're just speaking a different language sometimes. And it's about learning that language. And once you learn it, it becomes so beautiful. So I love my tribe. And I want to say that before we go into the PowerPoint, because the PowerPoint, and especially the book, to me still uses some pretty dated ideas. But I have a different perspective just because of who I am. But it's my duty to give you this information because I think that it's important to understand the world that you will be working in. But if you decide to go into a population or go into a setting where you serve people who are on the spectrum, take some time and really kind of sit with autistic voices. Social media is awesome for us because we don't really have to, we can socialize within a very comfortable environment. And so there's a lot of autistic advocates who are on social media, who write blogs, and their insight is tremendous. So if you are going to be working with that population, I would highly recommend that you seek out actually autistic voices, and you understand that you're there to empower them and amplify their voices, and make sure that they are accessing occupations that are important to them. Unfortunately, in the therapy world, sometimes we do what's reimbursable. And we know if it's, the autism community, or even if you're just working in rehab, what's reimbursable isn't necessarily what's best for the client. So I will leave it there, and we will go ahead and start with the PowerPoint. As I said, there we go. All right. So this has actually been adapted from my colleague, Karen England, who works over in the traditional MOT program. Autism spectrum disorder is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. It falls along that line. So a lot of times when people are talking about their tribe, especially a neurodiverse tribe, it includes everybody, like ADHD, learning disabilities, learning disorders, autism, spectrum disorders. These are people who just, frankly, they just think differently. So some features, some symptoms will revolve around social or communication skills, behaviors. It's very individualized. The saying is that if you meet one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum. We are all different and we all present differently. And in the medical community, they tend to say that we are low functioning to high functioning. I will not at this time get on my soapbox, but I do not prefer to describe anybody on the spectrum as being low or high functioning. But that is popular terminology. The DSM-5 for the diagnostic criteria include deficits in social communication and social interaction, restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. I call that, for me, being a professor. But you can either be including being hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. This was something new that was added to the DSM-5. Symptoms must be present in early developmental period, and they cause significant impairment to social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. And these disturbances are not better explained by an intellectual disability or some kind of developmental delay. Currently, there are 3 levels of autism. This is another thing that people in the community kind of push against, but level 3 is requiring very substantial support. Level 2 is requiring substantial support, and level 1 is requiring support. And I want to stop here for a moment and just kind of get on my soapbox for 20 seconds. So the unfortunate thing about being autistic or being on the spectrum is that autism is now defined by the diagnostic criteria. But just the diagnostic criteria alone is not really autism. And I think that we've kind of lost sight that being on the spectrum is, not only diverse, but there's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of really good things about being autistic, but that's not necessarily in the diagnostic criteria. So people tend to forget that. They forget that, things like hyperfocus. If you've met somebody, a lot of people who are on the spectrum are really, really good at 1 or 2 areas, and they become subject experts within a very short amount of time because they just saturate themselves. We see patterns and we see behaviors. People who are on the spectrum oftentimes kind of gravitate toward IT, coding, researchers, because we're very good at picking up patterns and behavior, patterns in anything. And identifying where a pattern is off. So I can go on and on about that, but that's kind of where I think a lot of the problem and a lot of the stigma surrounding autism comes from, because we now use the diagnostic criteria for autism, which highlight the challenges, as the definition of autism. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. All right, we'll go back to the PowerPoint. So you do not necessarily qualify for an IEP simply because you have been diagnosed medically as being autistic. You must have something that is happening that is impacting your school performance. So the IEP must document the child's educational difficulties and that are negatively impacting the child's academic performance. And this is important to note because some people assume that they will automatically get on an IEP simply because they have a medical diagnosis, and this is not true. You could qualify for an IEP, a student could qualify for a 504, or a student could qualify for nothing. I am an example of somebody who was not impacted academically in school, and so I never had a 504 or IEP. So just to kind of go over the history, by the way, just a shout out, Neurotribes is a phenomenal book, phenomenal. If you, and then I just saw that actually today on Amazon, the e-reader version of Neurotribes is on sale for $1.99, which is a great deal. Steve Silberman is actually from the area, from Western Mass, and so you could actually see him. He gives talks in the area quite frequently, and he's actually given talks at Bay Path. So if you have an extra $1.99, I highly suggest purchasing Neurotribes. But this is kind of the history of ASD. Starting in 1911, the Swiss psychiatrist Bleuler was the first person to use the word autism. Carl Jung in the 1920s termed autism as introverted schizophrenia. Oftentimes, actually not next semester, in the fall semester when we do mental health together, you'll see that there's a lot of similar symptomology. And so many people were misdiagnosed. And still today, many people who are autistic are often misdiagnosed with mental health disorders. In 1943, Dr. Leo Kanner was an American psychiatrist, and he began using the words autism and autistic more often. And then 1994, Dr. Hans Asperger coined the diagnosis for Asperger's syndrome. This very simply, sometimes people get confused what Asperger's means, and that really is somebody who's autistic who did not have language difficulties or was able to talk from an earlier age. So sometimes people think that in order to be autistic, you have to have struggles with speaking. That's not necessarily true. What the struggle is more with social interaction. And he was a person who called his subjects little professors, because people who are on the spectrum, they have special interests and they will talk your ear off about those interests because they love to do so. Nothing makes them happier. And like I said before, sometimes that turns into a job, which is pretty cool. So here is kind of a detailed outline of how the diagnosis of autism has changed. And I know that as we continue to learn more and we continue to make advances with especially imaging techniques, I think that these definitions and diagnostic criteria are going to continue to change. But what I thought was really interesting about this was that the IDEA did not include autism as a disability until 1991. I thought that was kind of interesting. So in the DSM-4, these are the diagnoses that were included in the DSM-4, and autistic disorder was labeled underneath a heading underneath pervasive developmental disorder. Important to note that Asperger's was actually a separate diagnosis from autism.
I have a question.
Sure.
On one of the previous slides, it was separating mothers from refrigerator mothers.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard of that, or was curious what that was.
Yeah, Keith, if you could do me a favor, I actually found a really interesting article about that because that's something new that my colleague actually introduced me to. I'd never heard that before. Yeah, so that's something that I had to kind of look into and research. So Keith, if you don't mind sending me an email when I share the PowerPoint, I will also include a link to the article about refrigerator mothers.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I could tell you, but I don't want to mess it up. And I'm not strong enough in explaining it yet. So. Yeah. So in the DSM-4, there was a typo. And under, in the PDD category, It accidentally substituted or for and in the definition of Asperger's syndrome, which led to a large increase of people being diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. There was also a lot of conversation about whether or not the cause of autism was linked to pollution, antibiotics, and most famously, vaccines. And I am here to tell you, vaccines do not cause autism. And the article written by Andrew Wakefield was actually retracted in 2011. But interestingly, I'll pause again. I want to know if any of you have actually heard of this. So Andrew Wakefield is still a researcher, and he's still producing some excellent quality research. And he has found a lot of links between the gut and the brain, and has found that there's what we eat and how our body processes what we eat largely affects inflammation in the brain. Did anybody know that Andrew Wakefield was still actively researching?
No.
Yeah, he was kind of really publicly shamed. He's producing, actually, it makes a lot of sense, not just from spectrum perspective, but a lot of mental health.
Is he the one that with the gluten with the kids and the dairy and all that on the behavioral?
Correct.
Dairy, okay.
He contributes to that, but it's a little bit broader. I think he looks more holistically at any kind of diagnosis that the symptoms may be made worse by inflammation in the brain. And so what he kind of looks at is the different types of foods and the way we process those foods and how they affect our neurobiology. So, makes sense.
Yeah.
Pretty cool stuff. Okay. So interestingly, a lot of people will also say that vaccinations have gone down. This is a really touchy and difficult subject for people to talk about, and I understand why. I think that as a community, not just as a medical community, but just as, you know, within the United States, I think we all need to do a better job of being able to have conversations and dialogue, because there are really significant concerns with vaccinations, or people may have questions about the side effects of vaccinations, and they do need a place where they can ask those things. Because right now, you basically have two camps, and you cannot exist anywhere in the middle. And I think that's unfortunate, because a lot of misinformation is spread, and there's a lot of fear. People are really afraid, and that's a very real human emotion. So I hope that we find a way to be able to talk a little bit about those, about vaccines and why they're useful, and address anybody's concerns that they may have in a respectful way. When I've worked in early intervention, people have asked me about vaccinations, and I always refer them to their pediatrician, because while I may have my own personal opinion, that should have no influence over my clients and the medical decisions that they make. So just be careful there. So the DSM-5, there was a couple things that happened with the DSM-5. One, Asperger's was removed, which made people as a standalone diagnosis. The other thing was they were really expecting sensory processing disorder to be added to the DSM-5, and it was not. Within all of this, there's a lot of controversy. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of years to see the DSM-6 come out. And I don't know if they'll add or if they'll change the criteria a bit based on the information that we have surrounding neurodiversity. Go ahead.
So I got a question for you. Those who were formally diagnosed with Asperger's, and they're not, I'm sure, wild about the change.
Mm-hmm.
What do they say? Do they say formally known as Asperger's, or are they adjusted, or they still continue? You know what I mean?
Yep. So
okay.
the diagnoses that I've seen, so people who were previously diagnosed as being Asperger's, sometimes they just hold on to that, or sometimes they now qualify, or they still qualify under the diagnostic criteria for autism. But I've seen some people who were previously diagnosed as being Asperger's have more communication disorders. So like expressive communication, receptive communication, there's a whole bunch, and that's more falls under the speech language pathologist. But that's kind of been the transition. Like if you were diagnosed with Asperger's, you don't necessarily fall under the diagnostic criteria for autism, then they probably fall under one of the speech disorders.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So a lot of people who are on the spectrum and are huge advocates, and they consider their right to exist a civil right, and I would absolutely agree with that. Their right not just to exist, but to define themselves and define who they are and what they need. If you have ever worked with people who are on the spectrum, one area of frustration is they're often told what it is that's best for them without actually ever getting input from somebody who's autistic. And you can imagine that would be frustrating because it's actually a pretty famous disability like slogan is nothing about us without us, meaning that you shouldn't be making any kind of policy decisions or insurance recommendations without actually autistic voices present. Not just present, but actually equally, or if not majority represented, in my opinion. But I think largely due to social media, there have been increased advocacy, collaboration, and efforts, which I think is amazing. And really seeking to redefine what autism is and how it presents. Because remember, as we were saying, a lot of people assume that autism is only the diagnostic criteria, and it's so much more than that. It is a spectrum disorder, and no two people are alike. Everybody's different. We all have strengths, but we all, not just people on the spectrum, everybody in this world has strengths and challenges and ways that they navigate through them. And people on the spectrum are no different. So 1 in 42 boys have been diagnosed, and 1 in 189 girls. I can tell you that there are way, way more girls out there who are autistic than are being diagnosed. So I'm going to pause on this and ask you a question. So why do you think that is? Go
Because boys usually just develop the behavior more of aggressive, where girls would be shy. And they're supposed to be the emotional and quiet ones.
Right.
They'll go under radar.
Right. So girls typically are, it's not that, well, they are quieter, but that's more about like society and expectations. And so girls essentially have behavioral training, right? Of how a girl should be, how a girl should behave. But girls on the spectrum are sometimes very different than boys on the spectrum. And we are very good at masking behaviors, meaning that we watch, we learn, we've finally kind of figured out what is socially acceptable and how we are supposed to react, and then we put on that mask. And within like a very limited time frame and limited circumstances, we can pass for typical because we've kind of learned the patterns of social communication and expectations and behaviors. The only time that girls are really picked up as being on the spectrum is if they do have any kind of speech delays. That's usually, the only thing. But the reason this is an issue is because many women are actually diagnosed later in life. There's an explosion of women who are being later diagnosed. I was diagnosed later in life. It didn't really kind of come to my attention until I left school and I started in the workforce. And suddenly, like, social interactions were just so different. They made no sense to me because I lost the predictability of the school environment. And that's actually very typical for women on the spectrum. Why that's a problem is that you are actually not eligible for services as an adult unless you were diagnosed as a child and received services as a child. So policy actually has gender bias in it because systemically women are not diagnosed until later in life. Fun fact. All right, I will go back to, so that's why they say it's more common in boys and then the female presentation is typically more severe. That's not true. It just, you typically don't pick up on the female presentation earlier unless it's more severe or unless somebody has more challenges. So this, another thing, lifelong disorder with no cure. The majority of people who are autistic that I talk to, we don't want a cure. We're good. So what causes autism? There's no denying that there's a genetic component. A lot of autism diagnoses for women and for some men actually come after their children are diagnosed. So when they go through that whole process, they're like, holy moly, this is actually me. So that often happens, but not all cases. It can't, genetics alone, they don't feel like it's only genetics. They look at genetics in the environment. They consider whether there are certain things that turn on the genes. I would actually just suggest that the expectations as somebody ages become different. And at some point along the way, if you're autistic, you're just going to struggle. If it's at a sensory level, if it's at the environment, the demands of the environment, the demands of social interactions. If you're autistic, that's going to come out somewhere. I don't necessarily think that anything turns on or off. I don't think you can turn on or off autism. And again, no two children are alike, but some signs and symptoms. Difficulty relating to others. Again, this does not mean that people who are autistic lack empathy. There's different types of empathy. I won't go off on a tangent too much, but sometimes I think autistic people are actually the most empathetic people because we realize that we may not necessarily know what you're thinking. And so therefore, we're more likely to try to put ourselves in your situation or try to understand what you're going through. But that's been my experience. They may not speak. They may have difficulty with communication. They don't, many autistics do not prefer to sustain eye contact. They are prone to repetitive behaviors such as hand flapping, rocking. They have echolalia, that perceptive speech, and sensory sensitivities. These things right here are called stims. This is another area of controversy. A lot of times, especially ABA, and we'll talk a little bit about ABA later, they try to suppress stims. And that is another area of frustration in the autistic community because our stims are the things that help us stay regulated. And they might look weird to you, but so what? You look weird to me. So I don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, as long as you're not hurting yourself, I would absolutely work with, and I have worked with people who've been on the spectrum to find safe stims. But stims are really calming and centering, and it's what helps us stay in our environment and be social with people.
But everybody does it. Not even those on the spectrum. Everybody.
Everybody does.
Get people who drive down the road, driving down the road, they're twirling their hair.
Yep. Everybody stims. You pace. If you're pacing, when you get upset and you're watching some kind of sports game and you're pacing back and forth.
Play with your beard.
And I do this all the time.
Right. That's a form of stemming.
Yeah.
How would you feel if we kept telling you stop?
I can't.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't. It would be super dysregulating if somebody like literally pushed your hands away.
Or you're focusing so much on not doing it.
I'd feel so off, yeah.
Even now, I've been sitting here just spinning back and forth in my chair.
Right. I mean, that all that is stemming, rocking.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So.
Right. And the thing that really frustrates me, and and I'll go, I don't want to go off on tangents, but so there's still in New York, there is an ABA center that still shocks their clients when they
Seriously?
All right, I'm not going to go off too much, but ABA, that actually was the standard. If your client was stimming, they had them hooked up, and they would shock people to make them stop stimming. And obviously that's fallen away, and they've rebranded, they've repackaged. But it's the Judge Rothenberg Center in New York. And their shock, it's not like a little like, not that any shock is okay. I don't think that you should do that to a person. But it's extremely painful.
There was the lad school in Rhode Island that closed down with a child mental, that they did the same thing, and they get closed down for that, right?
Nope. They're still open. Actually, there's an ongoing.
They're not in the same building.
Well, the Judge Rothenberg Center is not only is still open, it's still active, and there's a disability advocacy group called ADAPT. Oh, if you ever have a chance, check out ADAPT. They're fierce. They are the ones who, like, if you look at, they were trying to make changes to healthcare. They're the ones who are rolling their wheelchairs up into senators' offices and like, we're not leaving. They're fierce, but they are currently leading a rally, and they're, I think, forget what senator, they're in one of the senator's office from New York, to get this Judge Rothenberg Center closed down. But if you look out there, it's heartbreaking. It still happens.
Huh.
So, yeah. Yeah. Someday, one day, I'm just gonna go off and tell you all my pets, but I'll leave it there because. See if it's on this next slide. We'll get to it. But ABA is wildly popular. So they say that early identification is very important. And here are some red flags and warning symptoms. Again, this is all kind of revolving around speech, but this is not a one-size-fits-all. Some of the impairments to communication include difficulties with receptive language, expressive language, perspective taking and problem solving. Sometimes interactions that share feelings are difficult because a lot of times people who are on the spectrum are super literal. And so if it's my feeling, then we're not quite sure why it would matter to you. So these are some of the impairments to socialization. So you can see some of these unconventional behaviors. And of course, these hitting, biting self, these kind of stims are dangerous. And so you can definitely use a behavioral approach or a sensory-based approach to addressing these stims, or finding a stim that's not self-injurious to replace this with. They have difficulty anticipating future events, sometimes difficulty with transitions. They develop this rote answers. A lot of times autistic people will speak in script, and other things that are difficult about socialization. Some behaviors, remember, and I think Keith said it. I'm not sure if it was Keith, but behavior is communication. They're telling us something. So if you're seeing some of these behaviors, it may mean that they're anxious, or it could be self-regulate. They could be regulating. It could actually mean that they're really super happy. And so there's people who in my community, they call them flappy hands. So when they get really excited, they have flappy hands. That's their stim, but that's their way of like saying, I'm really, really excited. So here's some behaviors that you may see. They're runners, bolters. This is definitely a situation that's important to address. The rocking, hand flapping, sometimes head banging, sometimes biting, arranging things in a specific way. Again, it's comfortable, it's comforting. Moving objects to or away from their eyes, moving things within their peripheral vision. Again, this is stimming. If it's not self-injurious, I don't really know why anybody would want it to stop. Strong attachment to objects. Routines are very important. And they may have persistent review, or like they can recite parts of songs and movies. Cognition ranges. You could have a lower IQ, or you could be a genius. That sounds very much like everybody. It's very difficult to assess intellectual ability, especially if somebody's nonverbal. We never want to assume that somebody who doesn't prefer to use spoken word to communicate, that does not mean that they are unintelligent. And there's a strength for rote memory, again, with the lining up of the objects. We have scripts that we'll go to. But this is more about being able to access, we call people neurotypicals. So being able to access and communicate with neurotypicals. It's just a comforting way to do that. You may want to assess gross motor skills. Sometimes people who are on the spectrum have low tone, muscle weakness, definitely sensory issues. They can appear clumsy, difficulty staying in an upright posture, or have gravitational insecurity. They may also have difficulty with fine motor skills. And a lot of this, they think, has to do with the fact that due to sensory, or due to just wanting to interact with preferred items, they're not varying what they're playing with or interacting with. And so they're not developing the full range of fine motor skills. Oral motor skills may be impacted as well. This could be due to sensory issues. Either they're very sensitive, they don't want anything except for preferred foods or objects in their mouth. Or they could eat everything and anything, a lot of mouthing. And then we mentioned the sensory. What's most difficult for families, I think, is sleep. People who are on the spectrum tend not to sleep very well. And so especially if you're a parent and your child is up several times, or wakes up at 3 and then stays awake for the rest of the night, that's really exhausting. So again, we've talked about sensory a lot, so I'm not going to stay here too long, but a lot of people who are on the spectrum do have difficulties with sensory and processing the way that senses come into the body. We've also talked about this, interoception, which is the 8th sense. So this is being angry. This is when you're tired, everything feels bigger. But this could be the reason why so many people who are on the spectrum have difficulty learning how to use the toilet, because they literally may not know that they have to go to the bathroom. Something is off in their interoceptive systems, and they're not getting good feedback from their bladder to let them know that they need to go to the bathroom.
Is that the same? Because I was told like sensory have problems with bathroom because they don't get the sensation.
Right.
Okay.
So it could be that issue. I mean, toileting, I mean, it also could be a sensory thing because of gravitational insecurity. That's something that's actually, it's remarkable. Sometimes when children won't sit on the toilet, they're literally afraid they're going to fall in. So now, not just, they have toilet inserts that actually make the seat a little more stable, but it is absolutely amazing if you put a stool underneath for their feet to be on. It provides them with a lot more stability and gives them a little more reassurance that they're just not going to flail and fall backwards. So if you are working with somebody who's on the spectrum and they struggle to sit, even just sit on the toilet, try a stool to give them a little bit more gravitational security. Or another way is to install grab bars on either side to give them something to hold on to help reassure them that they're not going to fall into the toilet. So it could be sensory for that. It could be sensory because of the sound. It could also be sensory because they're not getting good feedback from their bodies. So it's just kind of a process to tease out and figure out what it is. So assessment, the modified checklist, we have the child autism rating scale, autism, the ADOS. The ADOS is for children, but it's also for adults. OT assessments include the sensory profile, the sensory processing measure, pediatric evaluation of disability inventory. You may need to kind of adjust depending on the child and what setting you're working on, because the assessments that you choose are going to be different for EI, they're going to be different for outpatient, school setting, mental health. So adjusting where you're working. Interventions include biomedical, ABA. ABA is the most authorized treatment for children who are on the spectrum. We also work on social skills. We also work on emotional regulation. I would invite you to look at actually Autistic Voices about what they say about ABA. Other interventions include helping them to engage in their occupations by using a PECS system, Picture Exchange Communication System. Animal-assisted therapy is something that a lot of people on the spectrum like. Know that not all animals are the same. So just because, like, a lot of people think of animal-assisted therapy and they think dogs. It could be horses, it could be a cat, it could be a hedgehog. There's a lot of animals. And so based on somebody's sensory, I would actually check out their sensory profile first before setting them up with animal-assisted therapy. Even dolphins. I thought that was interesting. Sensory interventions. A lot of times, sensory is considered the preparatory activity for ABA, but I think that it's so much more than that. We've talked a lot about sensory, so it's a really amazing approach, and more research is coming out about why it's so effective. Social stories are popular, but you can actually have a sensory story that helps people to identify when sensory situations are feeling like too big or overwhelming and what they can do during that situation. This last slide has some videos that my colleague found. Again, high functioning versus low functioning. I don't love those labels, but I understand why people use them. Temple Grandin is a pretty famous autistic advocate. So I invite you to learn more about her. But that is the end of the presentation. Any thoughts? Anything anybody wants to add before we say goodnight?
I just have a quick question. I guess a general question about the DSM. Are there age requirements to be diagnosed with certain diagnoses?
You know, I want to say that the lower threshold is 18 months, but don't hold me to that.
Mm.
That's another great question, and I'll find that answer. And when I send out about the article with refrigerator mothers, I will also send out the information on the diagnostic, the age range. There's no maximum age. People, I think it was Sir Anthony Hopkins was diagnosed, I think, when he was 68. So you can be diagnosed much later.
You can be diagnosed later, but their supports are more limited.
Right, because in order to receive, in the United States, in order to receive support at a state level, you must be diagnosed and receiving intervention before the age of 18. So.
And why is that?
Yeah, why is that?
Like who decides like at 21, nope, can't have it.
Right. So you're absolutely right. You're hitting on the frustration of a lot of people in the autistic community, because especially once you leave we were talking before about how important it is to find those patterns, and the education system itself is filled with patterns. Your class, a lot of people stay with the same cohort, as they age. So you learn the patterns of the people who are around you. You learn the patterns of your teacher. Once you leave that, it's like it's a different world, and it's a very scary. People don't interact with you in the same way as they do when you're in school. And so therefore you may need more support. Autistics are calling for more transition services because the unemployment rate amongst people on the spectrum is incredibly high, because they don't know how to navigate the social expectations and the communication expectations of the workforce. So. Yeah, it's frustrating. So
I mean, it's similar to like you can't be diagnosed with Alzheimer's unless you're at this age. Well, why?
Right.
It's like pediatric, schizophrenia. You can't diagnose that at an early age. Why?
Because diagnosed later, then that means it was probably schizophrenia when it was younger anyway. So
right,
had interventions earlier and maybe had a better outcome. So it's like, why wait?
Right. And I think that I'm hopeful that like I said, the advances that we have in imaging will help people better understand, and so that people can get earlier diagnosis, so they will be eligible for services. But I don't even know why that restriction is in place, because it's not logical to me. If somebody needs help and it's because of the difficulties of a diagnosis, then they need help. I wasn't less autistic, or I wasn't not autistic until I was an adult. I just got diagnosed.
In that retrospect, did it also help you not having a diagnosis? Because for some people, will hide under the label.
Right.
And if you don't have it, then you gotta like suck it up and just deal with it.
I think that if, and I'm being mindful of time, I see that we're getting close to being done. But I think that if I could look back at my life, I was really fortunate. I was in a military family, and I had a very small school, and I had a lot of, not just a military family, but a religious military family. So I had expectations for me. I don't know if the diagnosis would have made anything different. I just had a very structured life. And so it was that was very comforting to me. I understood the patterns of that. So if I had been diagnosed earlier.
Would that have changed maybe it did in school?
It wouldn't have changed anything in school, because I had about 7 people in my class.
Oh, okay.
And I was and again, like academic wise, I was always fine. I was always the top of my class. So I don't know. I find as an adult, there's a sense of acceptance, and there's a sense of relief. I can't tell you how relieving the diagnosis has been for me. So, but I might need services when I'm older, and I shouldn't be denied them just because I wasn't diagnosed.
Right.
When I was 5.
Right.
So, who knows? But
Thanks.
yeah. Well, thank you all. And I appreciate your willingness to allow me to be honest and share this part of me. And I thank you. And someday we'll have a very long discussion about ABA, I'm sure. So,
Cool.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
yeah, thank you. All right, everybody have a wonderful night and wonderful week.
Have a good night.
All right.